only thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, "In questions of power, then let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down for mischief by the chains of the Constitution."
Welcome to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live, and you found us on a Thursday, which means it's Foundations of Freedom Thursday. It's our chance to talk about how to bind down man with the chains of the Constitution and the founding principles of America. Just sort of diving into those a little bit more than we do on most days. I guess all days we touch some of these topics, David, but Thursday's kind of fun because we zero in on those founding principles.
And it's always fun because there are so many good founding principles in the Constitution, and the ones that I think people remember the most are the ones that have current application at that point in time. You know, the letters of marque, we really don't talk about it anymore because we don't have privateers that have their own navies that go out under letters of marque and act on behalf of the United States. So that's not as relevant a portion. It's still there. But what we get on Thursdays are people asking questions about what's going on right now in the news and in the culture, and therefore it brings that part of the Constitution to immediate application, and that's a fun part to look at and remember.
Well, in fact, folks that have questions right now that you're wondering about the founding of America or some of our principles, you can send in your questions to radio@wallbuilders.com. It's just radio@wallbuilders.com. We've got several of those questions to get to today. David, I'll throw the first one at you. It's from Zach. It says, after the Supreme Court refused to hear a case pertaining to same-sex marriage in the state of Alabama, the Chief Justice of the state chose to ignore the Supreme Court and refused to offer same-sex marriage licenses the next day. Though I do not support same-sex marriage, I do wonder if this action taken by the state justice is in any way constitutional. What do you guys think? And just to bring us up to speed from even when the time the question came up, David, I think actually the whole court, Supreme Court of Alabama, took action on that and said we don't want those licenses given because that's against our Alabama state law.
Yeah, and it wasn't like it was a close decision. The last, they had several rulings along the way. The last one by the Alabama Supreme Court was a 7-1 ruling. So this is, you know, for guys who are jurists, who are on the court, who have to deal with state and federal constitution, this is a pretty clear one for those guys sitting on the Alabama Supreme Court that they had a clear answer to this. Now, let me back up for a bit to another one. Rick, you and I here in the state of Texas, we have a state constitutional amendment that defines marriage as man, woman. We have had the federal courts uphold our definition of marriage here in the state of Texas. And yet we have had a state district judge down in Austin who has decided that he knows more than the state constitution, the federal constitution, the state courts, the federal courts, and he's declared that no, we're going to have same-sex marriage in Texas. And his decision actually dealt with, as I recall, correct me on this, but I think it was dealing with a trust, well, it was a will kind of a case.
It was a probate judge.
That's it.
Yeah.
It was a probate judge. It was a probate judge. And there was some estate stuff being left to someone that was in a homosexual relationship, etc. And so here in a probate setting, you have a state probate judge who has essentially said the federal courts are wrong, the state courts are wrong, I'm right, here's the new policy. So when you look at something like that, let's talk about that before we go into Alabama for a minute. First off, when you have a court that says that, the question always has to be, well, what does the Constitution itself say? And this guy obviously said, well, who cares what it says? Here's what I want. So you have to start distinguishing whether the decision by any court is a reflection of their own will or whether it's a reflection of the document they're sworn to uphold. In the case of this guy, this is a really dangerous guy to have as judge because he has now let you know that, yeah, I took an oath to uphold the state and federal Constitution, but I disagree with it, so we're going to do my will instead. And I don't think anyone disagrees that is what often happens with the court. As a matter of fact, I'll take you back to what Abraham Lincoln said, because he was, in his inaugural address, first inaugural address, you remember the hot issue back then was slavery and the Dred Scott decision. And the Dred Scott decision said blacks are not people, they're property. No black man has any rights with a white man is bound to respect was the famous little statement out of there. The federal court says the federal government cannot stop slavery in any federal territory, and you can't end slavery in Washington, D.C. So here comes Lincoln. He ends slavery in Washington, D.C. He stops slavery in other territories, and he declares slaves to be free in the Confederacy. So all of those violated that Supreme Court decision. How did he get away with that? And here's the logic that he expressed in his inaugural address. He says, I do not forget the position assumed by some that constitutional questions are to be decided by the Supreme Court. And that's where a whole lot of folks today are. Is, the Supreme Court gets final word on what's constitutional. He says, but at the same time, the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people, such as marriage or slavery in that day, is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. So he said, this is a constitutional question. Are the people in charge of their government, or is an unelected majority of 9 people in charge of the government? And so that's the first question you have to ask. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Texas court or whether it's the Alabama court. The question goes, is this a decision of the judges, or is this something that's actually constitutional? And we would have to say, well, since marriage is not covered in the federal Constitution, it has to be a 10th Amendment issue. But just basic constitutional interpretation. If it's not one of the 15 enumerated powers of the federal government, the feds can't touch it. It's a state issue. So at that point, the state of Alabama has made their decision, and that decision is marriage as a man and a woman. Here comes a federal judge says, well, we don't really agree with that, and we're not going to deal with this. And so suddenly that's open game for every official in Alabama to give same-sex marriage licenses. Alabama Supreme Court said, no way. We have our state constitution. It was voted on by the people. The people are the ones who put this in the Constitution, and state office holders take an oath to uphold the state constitution, and it's real simple. And that's what you got to do. And so that's why for even the Alabama Supreme Court, it was a 7-1 decision. And that's a court that does understand the role of the judiciary. I'm pretty sure the federal judiciary does not understand the role of the judiciary, but this is a state court that does. And so I would say what they've done is very much in line with the original intent, that since marriage is not in the federal Constitution, it is at least a 10th Amendment issue, which puts the state courts in charge of it.
It's interesting in listening to you talk through that history that today sometimes we think this judicial tyranny is a new thing, but Jefferson warned against it. You got Lincoln warning against it. I mean, it's been something it's the nature of man. Anybody
Jackson,
in power is going to try to get more power, right? So you
Jackson, Madison, George Washington, they all warned against it. I mean, that's the reason they created the Constitution the way they did in Article 3, is because the Founding Fathers warned against judicial tyranny, which is what they had from British judges. So this is not a new debate, and it's helpful for questions like this, because we get to go back and say, now remember, here's the role of the judges. And if I'm an airplane pilot, that doesn't qualify me to be a brain surgeon. If I'm an airplane pilot, that does not qualify me to be a diesel mechanic for over-the-road 16-wheel vehicle. And what the Supreme Court has said, since we're Supreme Court judges, we're qualified to know everything. And that's not true. And so that's why it's good to go back to original intent. As you said, this is judicial tyranny, judicial activism is not a new issue.
And even just spreading that out to all the branches, I mean, that's why they wanted separation of powers and checks and balances, right? Because anybody's going to try to abuse their power in that branch if you let them. And we've let this branch, the judicial branch, have basically complete power.
Human nature is to take the power given it and go further than it's supposed to. You can ask the president with his pen and his phone. You can ask the regulatory agencies who regularly pass federal laws that have nothing to do with Congress or the president. You can ask the courts. You can ask that judge in Texas that took an oath to uphold the state and the federal Constitution, and judges at both levels that said, well, marriage between a man and woman is fine. And he still says, well, I don't like that. I'm a judge, and here's what we're going to do. And at every branch, every level, you have that tendency. Whether it was Harry Reid to say, there's 287 bills passed by the House, but I don't want to consider any of them. Well, that's not the Senate. That's a leader of the Senate who has taken control. So, in every branch, if you do not have people willing to be loyal to the Constitution and to the integrity that goes with it, then they will take their own wishes and try to impose that on all the people.
which is why we got to bind them down with the change of the Constitution and make sure that it's actually being followed, and that's all of us have a role in making sure that that happens. Got to take a quick break. We'll come back and get some more of your questions and your emails. If you want to send some of those in today, send them to radio@wallbuilders.com. Back in a moment on WallBuilders Live.
George Washington. The Constitution approaches nearer to perfection than any other government hitherto instituted among men.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Federal courts have made several amazing rulings recently, ordering the removal of a cross from a cemetery, banning religious holiday displays, removing the Ten Commandments from public view, prohibiting student prayers whether verbal or silent, and numerous other similar restrictive rulings. As one current justice has noted, the Supreme Court has now become, quote, a national board of theology. Our founding fathers would be astounded. They designed the First Amendment to keep the federal courts completely out of this issue. As Thomas Jefferson forcefully declared, I consider the federal government as prohibited by the Constitution from meddling with religious exercises. The First Amendment was designed to keep decisions on religious expression out of the federal courts and in the hands of the local communities.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, the constitutions of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that is their right and duty, to be at all times armed, and that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press.
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live. Thanks for staying with us here on this Thursday. It's Foundations of Freedom Thursday. You can get more of these programs on our website in the archive section. Just go to the homepage at wallbuilderslive.com, click on the archive button. It'll bring up programs from several months back, and you can grab those Thursday programs to dive more into these principles of freedom. It's a chance for us to take your questions as well. Sort of drives our agenda in terms of which areas of our founding principles that we'll dive into. Next question, I'm going to read this email, and David, I think I should probably protect the innocent. I think if I say who sent it, this person may come under great attack at their university since they're a faculty member at a public university, but they're very encouraging. Here we go. They said, David and Rick, while traveling to a conference this week, I had the opportunity to catch up on listening to your WallBuilders podcast, and the two three-part series particularly that caught my attention were the ones on what polls teach us, and then on the Article 5 Convention. Thanks for all the educational information as well as encouraging information on the Convention of States. While I still need to listen to your webinar, I immediately found the Convention of States group on Facebook, liked them, and invite all my conservative friends to do the same. Could go on and on about how much I appreciate you guys, but I want to make some comments. And here's what this faculty member said. I'm a faculty member at a public university, and you'll find if you do your research that I'm the real deal. I am a born-again believer and a strong conservative. Y'all frequently make comments on your shows regarding how liberal the vast majority of the faculty are in our university systems in the nation, and I certainly agree with you. But please don't forget that God does place lights in these environments, which I truly work and pray to be every day. The light shining from even a small candle can shine a significant light, and God uses even the most ill-equipped and insignificant among us to be such lights. I'm a faculty advisor to our college Republicans on campus and truly enjoy encouraging, supporting, and advising a great group of students every year. We have a vibrant and active CRU ministry on campus, and many, many other great things are happening. Amidst the darkness of our culture and the liberal doctrine that assaults so many students, there are opportunities for Christians, like myself and others, to get involved and be a light for Jesus. Please pray for Christian conservatives on college campuses when you think about the liberal and dark world that surrounds us. Thanks for all you do. May God continue to bless your ministry, and may God bless the USA. Wow, David, that's encouraging, and that's important for us to keep that in mind because we do whack those liberal institutions quite a bit because they need whacking, but we also need to know that there are some great folks like this listener here that wrote in.
Yeah, and that's a great reminder is not to overcharacterize an institution because I have a tendency, because, what is it, roughly, we've looked at the numbers and these excessively high numbers of faculty, folks in universities that are liberal, that are opposed to nearly everything traditional Americans believe. And you forget that, yeah, there is that 10% or that 15% or whatever that is right. And from that viewpoint, I have to go back and also remind myself that I talk to a lot of universities and a lot of kids in universities and others, and very often I get kids coming up to me saying, I'm going to be a teacher so I can teach this stuff. And I stop those kids and say, no, you really don't want an education degree. You don't want to be a teacher. Please don't do that. Go ahead and spend the extra 4 years and get your PhD and become a teacher of the teachers. Because if you're a teacher, yeah, you'll get a classroom and you can go in and teach 30 kids every year. But if you're a professor, if you become a PhD and you teach the teachers, then you're going to have a class of 200 teachers, and each one of those will go out and touch 30 kids. And now you're looking at touching thousands of kids every single year through you rather than just 30 kids a year. And so, we already encourage these kids to get in and take the time to become college faculty and to take their viewpoint with them, their biblical, constitutional, conservative viewpoint, and get in there. And sometimes, and I know we do that because we need those conservatives, but boy, I sure don't mean to overlook the good ones that are out there. And there are definitely some good ones out there, and this is just a good reminder because whether it's this or whether it's mainstream media, there really are good reporters in the mainstream media. You don't see them as often as you would. We know there's good movies coming out of Hollywood. There's plenty of junk, but there's good movies too. And in every area, God's got good people planted. And so, kudos to her for what she's doing, but for also reminding us that there are good guys out there. And man, we need to encourage them and pray for them and also praise them for what they do, because you got to know how hard that is to be a person in her position on faculty in a university like that. And so, kudos to her for standing strong out there and taking those kids and trying to point them in the right direction.
Yeah, no doubt. You talk about being on the front lines of the culture war. They really are. Let me ask you this. We got another listener sent an email asking about legislation being passed where teachers, could not teach from a partisan point of view or even have candidates come to the classroom because it might, say to the kids that they have to be of that particular party. What would you say is the right balance on that? I mean, I would want them to be exposed at least to different ideas and even candidates coming into a classroom, but just not indoctrinated. How do you draw that line?
Well, this is the kind of thing that you really want and wish. And this is where I have to back up and say, all right, trying to keep the bad guys out of the classrooms now is in many ways shooting at the wrong things. It's like saying, oh, I don't like this orange tree. I'm going to kill the orange tree by picking all the oranges off the branches every year. That doesn't kill the orange tree. You got to go to the roots of it. And the reason we would have a discussion about keeping liberal groups out of the classroom from indoctrinating students is because we're at the point now in education where we no longer teach students how to think. We teach them how to learn. And because we teach them how to learn, they are very gullible to whoever is the last one to speak. You know how that was in the legislature. You had legislators you served with. Whoever the last lobbyist was in the office of certain legislators, they're the ones that would win the debate and get the vote. And so, I like that point. Oh, I didn't think about that. And so whoever the last one was to talk to them, that's where they'd go. And that's the way education systems have become, because we no longer teach kids how to think. If they knew how to think, they would listen to every argument that came through. They would analyze. They would take the strengths, the weaknesses. They would find its inconsistencies and say, well, that's an interesting argument, but it doesn't hold water because of this, this, and this. And that's really what we need to be doing more than anything else, is not protecting kids from certain viewpoints. We need to equip them to be able to handle the viewpoints that come in. And so we're just wrapping up a DVD on Common Core, brand new DVD, and that points out that that's one of the 8 things wrong with Common Core is it makes you learners rather than thinkers. And we've been doing that for 50 years in American education. So I don't think you can protect kids from a particular viewpoint, because if you take that perspective, what you're saying is we want conservative folks coming in. Well, that's indoctrinating to a viewpoint as well. You want kids to choose the conservative viewpoint because that is the rational viewpoint. That's the one that works statistically. That's the one that works historically. That's the one that's consistent with the Constitution that's made us the blessed nation we are. You want them choosing the right viewpoint. So I don't think you can necessarily protect them from one of the. Now, there's certain things you do want to protect them from. But in the sense of a liberal versus conservative philosophy, the other side's going to object just as strenuously if we get in there as we do when they get in there. The better thing to do is teach students how to think, not how to learn, and then they can evaluate and analyze, and they will come down on the right side.
Yeah, good stuff. Good balance right there. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back and get some more of your questions here on this Foundations of Freedom Thursday at WallBuilders Live.
Thomas Jefferson said, "The Constitution of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed, that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. Our founding fathers, despite their common love for America, did not always agree with each other in politics. Such was the case between John and Samuel Adams. John was the leader of the Federalist Party, and Samuel was the leader of the Anti-Federalist Party. Consequently, political disagreements were not unusual between these two. On October the 4th, 1790, Sam wrote John and told him, "Let ministers and philosophers, statesmen and patriots unite their endeavors to renovate the age by educating their little boys and girls and leading them in the study and practice of the exalted virtues of the Christian system." 2 weeks later, John wrote back and told Samuel that on this issue they both agreed. While these two prominent founding fathers disagreed on much, they both agreed on the importance of educating the next generation in the principles of Christianity.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
President Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live. Thanks for staying with us on this Foundations of Freedom Thursday. We've got time for, I think, maybe one more of our questions from the audience, David. This one comes from Zachary in Garland, Texas. It's right next door to where I grew up in Saxe, Texas.
I didn't know you grew up in Saxe, Texas?
I didn't even know if you knew there was a Saxe, Texas.
I know there's one. I didn't know you grew up there.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
It wasn't the big city back then, though. We were out in the sticks back then. Okay, so Zach says, one of the things I don't understand is the state-established churches we used to have in America. Were the state-established churches we used to have based on religion, or were they based on a variety of denominations? So I guess, if I understand his question right, David, maybe he's asking, was this, did the state support all different kinds of denominations, or did each state have its own denomination?
Yeah, the state-established churches wasn't like one state was Muslim, one state was Buddhist, another state was whatever. They were all Christian. And I think, depends on how you count the numbers, but a lot of writers say there were 9 of the 13 colonies that had state-established denominations, or state-established churches, but they were what we would call denominations. The two most prevalent of those state-established churches were the Anglican denomination and the Congregational denomination. Down across Virginia and South Carolina, you had the Anglicans, and then up across New England through Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut, etc., you had the Congregational denomination. Now, you could almost say they were like religions in some ways. As you look at Virginia, the Anglicans there, they treated Baptists and Presbyterians and Methodists as though they were an opposing religion. I mean, it's like the way Muslims treat Jews in some ways. That's an opposite religion. And so, in many ways, even though they were denominations, they acted like they were different religions. Now, you will find there were states like Pennsylvania they were basically a Quaker state, but they didn't have a state-established denomination. You go down to Georgia, and they were basically a Methodist state, but they didn't have a state-established denomination. And you can look at Maryland. They were kind of a Protestant state, kind of an Anglican state, kind of a Catholic state, but they didn't have a state-established denomination. So the state-established denominations were all based on Christianity, and they were all holdovers from Europe. They were established in America by the European powers that came that still had monarchs before the American Revolution. Once the Revolution came along, a few states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, others, they kept their state-established denominations, but they no longer persecuted those from other denominations. They still used tax dollars to help that denomination, but if you were from a different denomination, they welcomed you, they treated you the same, you had protection, you had rights of conscience, etc. we had to get rid of that monarchical attitude that we got from France and from Spain and from Great Britain that said we have a state-established denomination and you will worship the way we tell you to. So basically, they went away after the American Revolution, and those that held on for a few years longer still did not have the European characteristics of killing the people that disagreed with them.
How important was the kind of the birth of Jefferson's ideas and Roger Sherman's ideas as a result of seeing how that played out?
Well, what's interesting is people today say, "Oh, it was Jefferson's statute for religious freedom that changed the course of America." No, it changed the course of Virginia. What Roger Sherman did helped change the course in Connecticut. What happened with Charles Carroll and others helped change the course of Maryland. You got to remember, communication and transportation being what it was, this wasn't a national movement. Now, there were national ideas that caught on, but it had to be done in every single state. And so Jefferson didn't have influence in Pennsylvania. He didn't have influence in Georgia. What Jefferson did really affected the state of Virginia, but other guys did the same thing in their own states. And that's what built the United States, was every state doing their part.
Earlier this week, we had Mark Hall, who is a professor with a book on Roger Sherman. Be sure, if you missed that, to go to our archive section at wallbuilderslive.com and grab it. It's great information on one of those founders you may not be quite as familiar with. Thanks for listening today. It's been Foundations of Freedom Thursday here on WallBuilders Live.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
We stand undivided.